Now we all agree that Calvin Johnson's the best wide receiver in fantasy, but who's number 2? Is it Dez Bryant? Is it A.J. Green? I know what you're going to say.
I'm going to say Dez Bryant, and it's nothing against A.J. Green. I just think the light switch went on for Dez Bryant last year. Tony Romo gave a press conference where he literally said he thought the player had done a 180, and the very next week is when Dez's ridiculously hot streak happened. We always knew that this guy had this in him. We always knew this talent was there. We just finally saw it manifest. I know.
Trust him?
I do. There's a lot of bitterness at this table for Dez Bryant because he's been very disappointing in the past. But those 7 games, 47 catches, 792 yards, and 9 touchdowns. You prorate that over a season, that's an 1,800-yard receiving season with 20 touchdowns. Uncoverable in the end zone. I think he's a raw, more talented player than A.J. Green. I'm taking him as the second receiver.
So I'll start. I think it's kind of like a selective analysis that we're pointing to this Tony Romo press conference saying, look how great Dez Bryant is. You know, he makes sliced bread. He's fantastic.
But he hadn't happened yet.
Okay, it hadn't happened. But just because good numbers came after it doesn't mean that it validates that statement.
But it does lend it more credence. It doesn't validate it, but it lends it more
absolutely.
credence. Yeah.
But the fact of the matter is, you know, Dez Bryant has a long history of being a knucklehead. And you're investing a lot in the possibility of that not coming back. Whereas A.J. Green is steady. And despite Dez's, heroic 7-game run there, A.J. Green finished right with him. So I think there's much less risk. And there's a big risk with Dez regressing. And I'd rather have the safer pick in A.J. Green.
To say exactly what you're saying in a slightly different manner, I've seen A.J. Green do it as long as he's been in the NFL. He did it his rookie season. He did it last year. He's always been an elite, special, crazy talent. We've seen Dez Bryant do it for half a season. And so, we talk about this, and we talk about this all the time. Touchdowns are hard to repeat. And I agree with you. He's a beast in the red. He's a beast in the red zone.
I'm not sure in this case touchdowns are going to be hard to repeat. I really am not sure. I think 15 touchdowns in play.
Look, he had 9 the year before. I think 15 touchdowns are in play, but I think he could also have 8 or 10. And I think when you're sitting here trying to talk between number 2 or 3, look, Dez is awesome. And by the way, we're not even talking about Brandon Marshall, who had a monster season as well, and you expect him to have another great year with Cutler and Trestman there. They're certainly not going to throw less. So, I think you couldn't go wrong with any of these guys. But for me, I'm with Ken here, is that if you're going to use an early round pick, I want to go a little bit safe here. A.J. Green was like the #1 fantasy wide receiver for the first half of the year.
He was scoring a touchdown every week.
Yes, he was.
But Dez, when he had his big games, he had some really big games, and Green wasn't having those monster games.
Well, and there's a reason.
Green was always like right around double digits.
Well, the reason is because it's the difference between the quarterbacks. Honestly, I think every
a point in Dez's favor, no question.
That's a tiebreaker for me.
That A.J. Green on the Cowboys or on a team with what I consider to be a real quarterback, I just think Andy Dalton is a pop gun quarterback. I think you would see 20, 25-point games out of A.J. Green. You're not going to see them with Andy Dalton because the best Andy Dalton's going to do is hit him in the red zone occasionally and maybe throw some passes straight up in the air and A.J. Green gets a jump ball.
The other thing we're not mentioning here is that Dez Bryant played all 16 games last year, but it was the first time in 3 years that he'd done that. And remember, there was a point where fantasy owners were panicked because it looked like he was lost for the season with a thumb. And then, kudos to him, he came back, he played. But there is an injury concern with Dez Bryant that I don't think is there with A.J. Green as well.
Who's more likely, if Calvin Johnson was hurt, to be the #1 wide receiver in fantasy? Dez, if he does what he does again, or A.J. Green's solid reliability?
I think both. I think you can make an argument, a very solid argument for both guys. I would not be shocked if a year from now we're sitting at this very table, all of us, probably wearing the same outfits, saying, hey, wow, Dez Bryant, the #1 wide receiver in fantasy, or, wow, A.J. Green, clearly the #1 wide receiver in fantasy. Both guys have that kind of talent and potential.
But I want to talk about your question, because if you're talking about what they did last year, you're talking about the first half where Dez was invisible for a number of games?
We can't discount that.
Okay.
But the upside, A.J. Green was solid every week, but when Dez had his monster weeks, those were monster weeks.
You can't say A.J. Green doesn't have upside. I mean, come on.
No, he has.
He doesn't have the weekly upside that Dez does. Because of his situation, because of the quarterback, he doesn't have the weekly upside.
Okay, but what is the downside of A.J. Green?
I think it's a lot higher
than what Dez's downside is.